Imagine this. You've worked your entire life to achieve a dream. You've faced countless obstacles, fought through doubters, and climbed mountains to get where you are. And then, just when you think you've made it, someone looks you in the eye and tells you, you don't belong here. That's exactly what happened to Captain Maya Johnson, a trailblazing black pilot whose story is about to take a turn no one saw coming. It was a routine flight, or so she thought, until a single moment in first class changed everything, not just for her, but for an entire airline. This is a story about resilience, justice, and the power of standing your ground, literally. All started on a sunny Tuesday morning at JFK International Airport. Captain Maya Johnson, a seasoned pilot with over a decade of experience, was preparing to fly a packed commercial flight from New York to Los Angeles. She had earned her stripes in a male-dominated industry, breaking barriers and shattering stereotypes along the way. But even with her impressive resume and undeniable skill, she still faced the kind of prejudice that made her question whether some people would ever see her as anything more than the color of her skin. Still, she carried herself with pride, knowing she had earned her place in the cockpit. What she didn't know was that this flight would test her in ways she never imagined. Before the flight, Maya decided to take a seat in first class to review some last-minute details. Dressed in her crisp pilot uniform, she settled into her seat, her gold wings glinting under the cabin lights. But as she opened her flight manual, a voice interrupted her focus. "Excuse me, miss," a flight attendant said, her tone dripping with condescension. "This is first class. Are you sure you're in the right section?" Maya looked up, her expression calm but firm. "Yes, I'm sure," she replied, holding up her pilot's badge. The flight attendant's eyes narrowed and she leaned in closer. "Well, you don't look like you belong here. Maybe you should double-check your ticket." The words hit Maya like a punch to the gut. She had faced microaggressions before, but this was different. This was blatant. This was personal. The tension in the cabin was palpable as other passengers began to notice the exchange. A few whispered to each other, their eyes darting between Maya and the flight attendant. Maya took a deep breath, refusing to let the moment shake her. "I'm Captain Maya Johnson," she said, her voice steady, but commanding. "I'll be flying this plane today, and yes, I do belong here." The flight attendant's face flushed, but before she could respond, a man in a suit, clearly a high-ranking airline executive, stepped in. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone sharp. The flight attendant hesitated, then gestured toward Maya. "She's insisting she's a pilot, but—" The executive cut her off, his eyes scanning Maya's uniform. "Captain Johnson," he said, his voice cold, "perhaps it would be best if you waited in the cockpit. First class is for passengers." Maya's heart raced, but she refused to back down. She had spent her entire career proving herself, and she wasn't about to let anyone undermine her now. "With all due respect," she said, her voice rising, just enough to be heard by everyone nearby. "I am the captain of this flight, and if you have a problem with that, I suggest you take it up with the airline." The executive's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing a slight delay, but we'll be underway shortly." The voice was calm, confident, and unmistakably Maya's. The passengers erupted into applause, their support for her evident, but the executive's face turned red with anger. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath as he stormed off. As the plane finally took off, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The flight itself was smooth, but the tension among the crew was undeniable. The flight attendant who had confronted her avoided eye contact, and the executive spent the entire flight on his phone, his expression grim. Maya focused on her job, but her mind kept drifting back to the confrontation. She knew this wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. And she was determined to do something about it. When the plane landed in Los Angeles, Maya expected the drama to be over. But as she stepped off the plane, she was met by a group of airline officials waiting on the tarmac. Their faces were stern, their arms crossed. "Captain Johnson," one of them said, "we need to have a word with you." Maya's heart sank. She had faced adversity before, but this felt different. This felt like a fight she couldn't afford to lose. As she followed them into a private room, she couldn't help but wonder what was coming next. What she didn't know was that her next move would send shockwaves through the entire airline and ground their entire fleet. The room they led Maya into was small and sterile, with fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead. The air felt heavy, and the tension was so thick it could have been cut with a knife. The officials sat across from her, their expressions unreadable. One of them, a middle-aged man with a sharp suit and an even sharper gaze, leaned forward. "Captain Johnson," he began, his voice measured but cold, "we've received some concerning reports about your conduct on today's flight." Maya's stomach dropped. She had expected pushback, but this felt like an ambush. "Concerning reports?" she repeated, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "From whom? The flight attendant who questioned whether I belonged in first class? Or the executive who told me to wait in the cockpit like I was some kind of imposter?" The man didn't flinch. "This isn't about one incident," he said, sliding a folder across the table. Maya opened it, her eyes scanning the contents. It was a list of complaints, some recent, some dating back months, all alleging unprofessional behavior, insubordination, and even incompetence. Her heart raced as she read through them. None of it was true. She had always gone above and beyond for her job, often working double shifts, mentoring younger pilots and volunteering for extra duties. But here it was, in black and white, a carefully constructed narrative designed to paint her as the problem. "This is ridiculous," she said, slamming the folder shut. "These are lies. Who's behind this?" The man leaned back, his expression smug. "That's not important. What's important is that we take these allegations seriously. As of now, you're being placed on administrative leave pending an investigation." Maya's blood boiled. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let them take this away from her. "You can't do this," she said, her voice rising. "I've done nothing wrong. This is about race, plain and simple. You don't want a black woman in charge of your planes." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The man's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. "We'll be in touch," he said, his tone final. As Maya left the room, her mind raced. She knew she couldn't let this go. This wasn't just about her career. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. She thought about the young black girls who looked up to her, the ones who sent her letters telling her she was their hero. She thought about her parents, who had worked multiple jobs to put her through flight school. She thought about the countless times she had been underestimated, overlooked, and dismissed. This wasn't just her fight, it was theirs too. Determined to clear her name, Maya began digging into the complaints. She reached out to colleagues, reviewed flight logs, and even hired a private investigator to help her uncover the truth. What she found was shocking. The complaints had all been filed by the same small group of people, all of whom had ties to the executive who had confronted her on the plane. It was a coordinated effort to push her out, and it went all the way to the top. But why? What were they so afraid of? As Maya dug deeper, she uncovered a web of corruption within the airline. Safety violations had been swept under the rug, maintenance, records had been falsified, and corners had been cut to save money. The executives were more concerned with their bottom line than with the safety of their passengers. And Maya, with her impeccable record and unwavering integrity, was a threat to their operation. They couldn't afford to have someone like her in a position of power, so they tried to silence her. But Maya wasn't the type to stay silent. She began documenting everything, every email, every conversation, every piece of evidence she could find. She reached out to journalists, lawmakers, and even the FAA, determined to expose the truth. But the deeper she went, the more dangerous it became. She started receiving anonymous threats, phone calls in the middle of the night, letters left, on her doorstep, even a break-in at her apartment. Someone was trying to scare her into backing down, but Maya wasn't scared. She was angry. Meanwhile, the airline was feeling the pressure. Passengers had started to notice the delays and cancellations, and rumors were spreading about safety concerns. Social media was ablaze with stories of Maya's confrontation on the plane, and the public was firmly on her side. Hashtags like Sak Stand with Maya and Belong in the Skies were trending, and people were calling for accountability. The airline's stock price was plummeting, and the executives were scrambling to contain the fallout. But Maya wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been wronged by the system. As the investigation into the airline's practices gained momentum, Maya found herself at the center of a media storm. Reporters camped outside her apartment, and she was invited to speak on national television. But with the spotlight came even more scrutiny. The airline's lawyers were working overtime to discredit her, digging into her past and twisting her words. They painted her as a disgruntled employee with an axe to grind, trying to turn the public against her. But Maya refused to back down. She knew the truth, and she was determined to make sure the world knew it too. The tension reached a boiling point when the FAA announced it was launching a full-scale investigation into the airline. Flights were grounded, and the company was forced to cancel hundreds of trips, leaving passengers stranded and employees furious. The executives were in panic mode, but Maya knew this was just the beginning. She had the evidence to bring them down, but she also knew they wouldn't go quietly. The stakes were higher than ever, and the fight was far from over. As the days turned into weeks, Maya found herself walking a tightrope. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but she couldn't afford to let her guard down. Every move she made was being watched, and every decision carried consequences. She knew she was close to exposing the truth, but she also knew the risks. The airline had already shown they were willing to play dirty, and Maya had no doubt they would do whatever it took to protect their secrets. But she wasn't going to let them win. Not this time. And then, just when she thought things couldn't get any more intense, she received a phone call that changed everything. It was from a whistleblower inside the airline, someone who claimed to have proof of even more egregious violations. But before they could meet, the whistleblower went silent. Maya tried calling, texting, even showing up at their house, but they were nowhere to be found. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. The mystery deepened, and Maya couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Someone was always one step ahead, and she had no idea who she could trust. The story was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. Maya knew she was playing with fire, but she also knew she couldn't stop now. The truth was too important, and too many people were counting on her. But as she sat in her apartment surrounded by stacks of documents and the weight of the world on her shoulders, she couldn't help but wonder, how far would they go to silence her? And more importantly, how far was she willing to go to fight back? Maya sat in her dimly lit apartment, the glow of her laptop screen casting shadows across her face. The whistleblower's disappearance gnawed at her. Who were they? What did they know? And why had they reached out to her only to vanish? She scrolled through the last message they had sent. Meet me at Hangar 7 tomorrow at midnight. Come alone. Trust no one. The words echoed in her mind, but the meeting had never happened. Instead, she'd found the hangar empty, the silence unnerving. Now, days later, she was no closer to answers. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a text from her friend and fellow pilot, Javier. You okay? Saw the news. They're really coming for you. Maya sighed. The media frenzy had only intensified. Headlines screamed about the airline's grounding, with some outlets painting her as a hero and others as a troublemaker. The airline's PR team had launched a counter-campaign, accusing her of fabricating evidence to sabotage the company. It was a classic smear tactic, but it was working. Even some of her colleagues had started to distance themselves, afraid of being dragged into the controversy. Javier's next message popped up. You need backup. Let me help. Maya hesitated. She trusted Javier. They'd flown together for years, but the whistleblower's warning rang in her ears. Trust no one. She typed back, I'm fine, just laying low for now. But The truth was she wasn't fine. The pressure was mounting and she was running out of time. The FAA investigation was moving slowly, and the airline's lawyers were working overtime to discredit her. If she didn't find something concrete, soon the whole thing could fall apart. Meanwhile, across town, the airline's executives were in crisis mode. In a sleek high-rise office, CEO Richard Grayson paced the room, his face flushed with anger. "How did this happen?" he barked at his team. "How did one pilot bring us to our knees?" No one dared to answer. The room was filled with nervous energy, the kind that comes when people know their jobs and possibly their freedom are on the line. Grayson stopped pacing and turned to his head of security, a burly man named Victor Kane. "Find her," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Find out what she knows and shut her down. Permanently." Kane nodded, his expression grim. He had a reputation for getting things done, no matter the cost. As he left the room, Grayson turned to the rest of his team. "And for God's sake, keep the media off our backs and spin this however you have to. Make her look like the villain." The room erupted into a flurry of activity, but Grayson's mind was already elsewhere. He knew Maya Johnson was a threat, but he also knew she wasn't working alone. Someone inside the company was feeding her information, and he was determined to find out who. Back at her apartment, Maya was deep in thought. She had to find the whistleblower, but she didn't even know where to start. Then it hit her, the hangar. There had to be a reason they chose Hangar 7. Maybe it wasn't just a meeting spot. Maybe it was a clue. She grabbed her jacket and headed out, her heart pounding. The airport was eerily quiet at night, the usual bustle replaced by an unsettling stillness. As she approached Hangar 7, she noticed something she hadn't before. A small, unmarked door on the side of the building. It was slightly ajar. Inside, the hangar was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the high windows. Maya's footsteps echoed as she moved cautiously through the space. Then she saw it, a folder lying on a workbench partially hidden under a stack of papers. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. Inside were maintenance logs, emails, and photos, all pointing to a pattern of negligence and cover-ups. But what caught her attention was a note scribbled on the back of one of the photos. "Follow the money. Look into Grayson's offshore accounts." Maya's mind raced. Richard Grayson, the CEO, had offshore accounts. This was bigger than she thought. But before she could process it, she heard a noise behind her. She spun around, her heart in her throat. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice echoing in the empty space. No one answered, but she could have sworn she saw a shadow move in the corner. She clutched the folder to her chest and backed toward the door, her instincts screaming at her to run. Just as she reached the exit, a voice stopped her in her tracks. "You shouldn't be here," a man said, stepping out of the shadows. It was Victor Kane, his expression cold and unreadable. Maya's breath caught in her throat. She had seen him before, lurking in the background at company events, but she had never spoken to him. Now, standing face to face with him, she felt a chill run down her spine. "Neither should you," she shot back, trying to keep her voice steady. Kane smirked. "You're in over your head, Captain. Walk away while you still can." Maya didn't respond. She knew better than to engage. Instead, she turned and bolted out the door, clutching the folder like her life depended on it. She didn't stop running until she was back in her car, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the keys. She had the evidence, but she also had a target on her back. And now she had no doubt that Kane, and whoever he worked for, would stop at nothing to silence her. As she drove away, her mind raced with questions. Who had left the folder for her? Was it the whistleblower? And why had Kane been there? The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but the picture they formed was more dangerous than she had imagined. She knew she had to act fast, but she also knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed allies, people she could trust. But in a world where everyone had something to lose, finding those people was easier said than done. The next morning, Maya woke up to a barrage of missed calls and texts. The airline had issued a statement accusing her of trespassing and stealing confidential documents. They were threatening legal action, and the media was eating it up. But Maya didn't have time to worry about that. She had bigger problems. The folder she had found was a goldmine of information, but it was also a ticking time bomb. If she didn't get it into the right hands soon, it could all be for nothing. She reached out to a journalist she trusted, a woman named Elena Martinez who had covered corporate scandals for years. They met at a quiet cafe, away from prying eyes. "This is huge," Elena said as she flipped through the documents. "If this is true, it could bring down the entire company." Maya nodded. "But we need to move fast. They're already trying to discredit me, and I'm pretty sure they're watching my every move." Elena looked up, her expression serious. "Then we'll have to be smarter than them. Let me dig into this. I'll see what I can find." As Maya left the cafe, she felt a glimmer of hope. But it was short-lived. As she turned the corner, she saw a black SUV parked across the street. The windows were tinted, but she could feel someone watching her. Her stomach churned. They were getting bolder, and she was running out of places to hide. She quickened her pace, her mind racing. She had the evidence, but she also had enemies, powerful enemies who would do anything to protect their secrets. And now, they were closing in. Maya's heart pounded as she walked briskly down the street, the black SUV still visible in her peripheral vision. She didn't dare look back, but she could feel the weight of their eyes on her. Every step felt like a mile, every sound, a car door slamming, a dog barking, made her jump. She needed to get somewhere safe, somewhere they couldn't reach her. But where? Her apartment was out of the question. They knew where she lived. Javier's place, maybe. But she couldn't risk dragging him into this. Not yet. She ducked into a small bookstore, the kind with narrow aisles and dusty shelves that seemed untouched by time. The bell above the door jingled softly as she entered, and the elderly shopkeeper glanced up from his newspaper but said nothing. Maya moved to the back of the store, pretending to browse the shelves while keeping an eye on the street outside. The SUV was still there, idling ominously. She pulled out her phone and texted Elena. "I think I'm being followed. Need a safe place to meet." A moment later, Elena replied, "Come to my office, use the back entrance, I'll wait for you." Maya slipped out the bookstore's rear exit, cutting through alleys and side streets to throw off anyone tailing her. Her mind raced as she walked. The folder she had found in the hangar was a ticking time bomb, and she knew it was only a matter of time before the airline's executives made their next move. She had to stay ahead of them, but it was getting harder. Every shadow felt like a threat, every stranger a potential enemy. By the time she reached Elena's office, she was out of breath and on edge. Elena was waiting for her expression a mix of concern and determination. "You okay?" she asked, ushering Maya inside. Maya nodded, though she was far from okay. She handed Elena the folder, her hands trembling. "This is everything, maintenance logs, emails, financial records, it's all there. Grayson's offshore accounts, the safety violations, the cover-ups. It's enough to bring them down, but we have to move fast." Elena flipped through the documents, her eyes widening as she took in the scope of the corruption. "This is explosive," she said. "But if we go public with this, there's no turning back. Are you ready for that?" Maya hesitated. She had come this far, but the stakes were higher than ever. Going public would mean putting herself in the crosshairs of some of the most powerful people in the industry. It would mean risking everything, her career, her safety, even her life. But she also knew she couldn't back down now. Too many people were counting on her. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. "Let's do this." Elena nodded, already pulling up her contacts list. "I'll start reaching out to my sources. We'll need to coordinate this carefully, timing is everything. If we can get this out before they have a chance to react, we might just pull it off." Maya sank into a chair, her mind racing. She had done everything she could, but the hardest part was yet to come. The airline's executives weren't going to go down without a fight, and she had no doubt they were already planning their next move. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit boardroom, Richard Grayson was holding an emergency meeting with his inner circle. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with anger and fear. "She has the documents," Grayson said, his voice low and dangerous. "If this gets out, we're finished. We need to contain this now." Victor Kane leaned forward, his expression grim. I've got men watching her, but she's slippery. She's not working alone. Someone's helping her. Grayson's jaw tightened. Find out who, and make sure they regret it. As the meeting adjourned, Kane pulled out his phone and sent a series of cryptic messages. His network was vast, and he had no qualms about using it to get what he wanted. By the time Maya left Elena's office, a net was already closing in around her. She could feel it, the sense of being hunted, of time running out. But she also knew she couldn't stop now. She had come too far to turn back. That night, Maya stayed at a small, nondescript motel on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't much, but it was off the radar, or so she hoped. She spent the night poring over the documents, looking for anything she might have missed. There had to be something, some piece of evidence that would make this airtight. As she worked, her phone buzzed with updates from Elena. The story was coming together, but it wasn't ready yet. They needed more time, but time was the one thing they didn't have. Just after midnight, there was a knock at the door. Maya froze, her heart in her throat. She wasn't expecting anyone, and the motel clerk had assured her that no one knew she was there. The knock came again, louder this time. Maya, it's me, a voice called. It was Javier. She hesitated, then opened the door a crack. What are you doing here? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Javier looked worried. I heard what's going on. You can't do this alone. Let me help. Maya wanted to trust him, but the whistleblower's warning echoed in her mind. Trust no one. Still, she couldn't do this alone. She needed allies, and Javier had always been there for her. She let him in, but the tension between them was palpable. We need to be careful, she said. They're watching me. They're watching all of us. Javier nodded, his expression serious. I know, but we're stronger together. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. As they talked, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Javier seemed sincere, but there was a nervous energy about him that she hadn't noticed before. Before she could say anything, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Elena. We've got a problem. Someone leaked part of the story. It's going viral, but it's incomplete. We need to move now. Maya's stomach dropped. If the story was out there but incomplete, it would only give Grayson and his team time to spin the narrative. They had to act fast. But as she turned to Javier, she noticed something. A flicker of guilt in his eyes. What's wrong? She asked, her voice tense. Javier hesitated, then sighed. I didn't want to tell you this, but they came to me. Grayson's people. They offered me a deal, money, a promotion, everything I've ever wanted. All I had to do was convince you to back down. Maya's heart sank. And? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Javier looked her in the eye. I told them no, but they're not going to stop. They're desperate, Maya, and desperate people do desperate things. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Maya knew what she had to do. She grabbed the folder and her phone, her mind made up. We need to go. Now. Javier nodded, but as they stepped outside, they were met with the blinding glare of headlights. The black SUV was parked across the lot, its engine idling. The doors opened and Victor Kane stepped out, flanked by two men. Going somewhere? He asked, his voice dripping with menace. Maya's heart raced as she backed away, clutching the folder to her chest. She had come so far, but now, with Kane standing between her and freedom, she realized just how dangerous this fight had become. The stakes had never been higher and the clock was ticking. She had the evidence, but getting it into the right hands was another matter entirely. And as Kane took a step closer, his expression cold and unreadable, Maya knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Maya's breath caught in her throat as Victor Kane and his men advanced, their footsteps crunching on the gravel parking lot. The folder in her hands felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, the evidence inside now more dangerous than ever. Javier stepped in front of her, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. Kane, listen, he said, his voice steady but urgent. This doesn't have to go down like this. We can talk about this. Kane didn't even glance at him. His cold, calculating eyes were locked on Maya. "Hand over the folder, Captain," he said, his tone calm but menacing. "This is your last chance to walk away." Maya's grip tightened on the folder. She couldn't give it to him. Not after everything she'd been through, not after everything she'd uncovered. But before she could respond, Javier turned to her, his expression pleading. "Maya, just give it to him. It's not worth your life." For a split second, she hesitated. Was he right? Was this fight worth dying for? But then she thought about the whistleblower, who had risked everything to get her this information. She thought about the passengers who trusted the airline to keep them safe. She thought about all the people who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong, and she knew she couldn't back down. "No," she said, her voice firm. "This ends here." Kane's expression darkened and he nodded to his men. They moved forward, their intentions clear. But just as they reached for her, a loud screech of tires broke the tension. A car came barreling into the parking lot, its headlights blinding. Maya shielded her eyes, her heart racing as the car skidded to a stop just feet away. The door flew open, and Elena Martinez stepped out, a camera in one hand and a phone in the other. "Back off, Kane," she shouted, her voice ringing with authority. "This is live. Every move you make is being streamed to thousands of people right now." Kane froze, his men glancing at him uncertainly. The power dynamic had shifted in an instant. Maya could see the gears turning in Kane's head as he weighed his options. He couldn't risk a public confrontation, not with the world watching. But he also couldn't let Maya walk away with the folder. The standoff stretched on, the tension so thick it felt like the air itself might crack. Finally, Kane took a step back, his expression unreadable. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Then he turned and got back into the SUV, his men following suit. The vehicle sped off, leaving Maya, Javier, and Elena standing in the eerie silence of the parking lot. Maya let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "Elena, you're a lifesaver," she said, her voice shaking. Elena grinned, though her hands were still trembling. "I told you I'd have your back. But we're not out of the woods yet. That live stream bought us some time, but Grayson's not going to let this go. We need to get this story out. Now." Maya nodded, her mind racing. She knew Elena was right, but she also knew that going public would mean exposing herself to even greater danger. There was no turning back now. They piled into Elena's car. Maya couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. Javier had saved her back there, but his earlier confession about Grayson's offer still lingered in her mind. Could she really trust him? She glanced at him in the rearview mirror, his face pale and drawn. He caught her eye and gave her a small, reassuring smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Something about it made her uneasy. They drove to a secure location Elena had arranged, a small, nondescript office on the edge of the city. It was a temporary safe house, a place where they could work without fear of being interrupted. As they set up their laptops and began compiling the evidence, Maya's phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was distorted, robotic. "You think you've won, Captain Johnson, but the game isn't over yet. Check your email." The line went dead. Maya's hands trembled as she opened her email. There was a new message, with no subject line and no sender. She clicked on it and her blood ran cold. It was a video, a grainy, shaky clip of the whistleblower bound and gagged in a dark room. The message below was simple. Drop the story, or they die. Maya's stomach churned. She had thought the whistleblower had disappeared, but now it was clear they had been taken, and it was all because of her. Elena and Javier crowded around her, their faces pale as they watched the video. "We have to call the police," Elena said, her voice urgent. But Maya shook her head. "No, if we involve the police, they'll kill the whistleblower. We have to handle this ourselves." Javier looked at her, his expression a mix of fear and determination. "What's the plan?" he asked. Maya took a deep breath, her mind racing. She had no idea what to do next, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't let the whistleblower die because of her. She had to find them. And she had to do it fast. As they began to strategize, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The office felt too quiet, too still. She glanced out the window, her heart pounding. Was that movement in the shadows? Or was it just her imagination? She didn't know anymore. All she knew was that the stakes had never been higher. The airlines, executives were desperate, and desperate people did desperate things. And now, with the whistleblower's life on the line, Maya realized just how far they were willing to go. The clock was ticking and every second counted. But as Maya prepared to make her next move, she couldn't help but wonder, was she walking into a trap? And if she was, would she be able to get out alive? Maya's hands shook as she stared at the email, the grainy video of the whistleblower looping on her screen. The message was clear. Drop the story or they die. Her mind raced, torn between the need to expose the truth and the fear of what might happen if she didn't comply. Elena and Javier were silent, their faces pale as they processed the threat. "We can't let them win," Elena finally said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. "If we back down now, they'll just keep doing this to someone else." Maya nodded, but the weight of the decision pressed down on her. She couldn't let the whistleblower die, but she also couldn't let Grayson and his team get away with everything they'd done. Javier broke the silence. "There's another way," he said, his voice low. "We give them what they want, or at least make them think we are. We set a trap." Maya and Elena turned to him, their expressions a mix of surprise and skepticism. "What kind of trap?" Maya asked. Javier leaned forward, his eyes intense. "We tell them we'll hand over the folder in exchange for the whistleblower. We set up a meeting, but we bring backup. We record everything. If we can get them to admit what they've done on camera, it's over for them." It was risky, but it was the only plan they had. Maya agreed and they got to work. Elena reached out to her contacts, arranging for a team of trusted journalists to be on standby. Javier made the call to Kane, his voice steady as he negotiated the terms of the exchange. Maya's heart pounded as she listened, her mind racing, with all the ways this could go wrong. But she also knew they had no other choice. The whistleblower's life depended on them. The meeting was set for midnight at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It was isolated, the perfect place for a confrontation. As they drove there, the tension in the car was suffocating. No one spoke, each lost in their own thoughts. Maya clutched the folder in her lap, her knuckles white. She had come so far, but this was the moment of truth. Everything hinged on what happened next. When they arrived, the warehouse loomed in, the darkness, its broken windows and rusted walls giving it an eerie, foreboding feel. Maya, Javier, and Elena stepped inside, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the empty space. A single light flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the floor. And then they saw them, the whistleblower, tied to a chair in the center of the room, their face bruised and bloodied. Behind them stood Victor Kane and two of his men, their expressions cold and unreadable. "You brought the folder?" Kane asked, his voice cutting through the silence. Maya held it up, her hand trembling. "Let them go first," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. Kane smirked. "You're not in a position to make demands, Captain." But before he could say more, Javier stepped forward. "We're not playing games, Kane. Let them go or this ends badly for all of us." Kane's eyes narrowed, but he nodded to his men. They untied the whistleblower, who stumbled toward Maya, their eyes filled with gratitude and fear. As soon as the whistleblower was safe, Maya handed the folder to Kane. He flipped through it, his smirk widening. "You really thought you could take us down?" he said, his voice dripping with disdain. But before he could say more, Elena stepped forward, her phone in hand. "Actually, we already did," she said, her voice ringing with triumph. "This whole thing has been live-streamed, every word, every move, it's all out there. You're finished." Kane's expression shifted from smug to furious in an instant. He lunged toward Elena, but Javier stepped in, tackling him to the ground. The two men grappled, the sound of their struggle echoing through the warehouse. Maya rushed to help, but one of Kane's men grabbed her, his grip like iron. She fought back, her training kicking in as she twisted out of his hold and delivered a sharp blow to his ribs. He staggered back, giving her enough time to grab a piece of broken pipe from the floor. She swung it, the sound of metal meeting flesh making her stomach churn. He went down, and she turned to help Javier. But as she did, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Kane had pulled a gun, its barrel glinting in the dim light. He pointed it at Javier, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You should have stayed out of this," he snarled. Time seemed to slow as Maya screamed, "No!" But before Kane could fire, a deafening shot rang out. Maya froze, her heart in her throat. But it wasn't Javier who fell. It was Kane. He crumpled to the ground, the gun slipping from his hand. Behind him stood the whistleblower, a smoking gun in their hand, their expression a mix of relief and determination. The warehouse fell silent, the only sound the distant wail of sirens. Maya rushed to Javier, who was shaken but unharmed. Elena was already on the phone with the police, giving them their location. The whistleblower lowered the gun, their hands trembling. "I couldn't let him hurt you," they said, their voice barely above a whisper. Maya nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You saved us," she said. "Thank you." As the police arrived and took Kane and his men into custody, Maya felt a wave of relief wash over her. It was over. The truth was out, and Grayson and his team would finally face justice. But as she watched the whistleblower being led away by paramedics, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. There was a look in their eyes, a flicker of something she couldn't quite place. It wasn't until later, when the dust had settled and the adrenaline had faded, that she realized what it was. The whistleblower wasn't just a random employee. They were Grayson's estranged sibling, someone who had been working from the inside to bring him down. They had risked everything to expose the corruption, knowing it would destroy their family, but believing it was the right thing to do. Maya was stunned. All this time, the person who had helped her the most had been closer to Grayson than anyone had realized. As the sun rose over the city, Maya stood outside the police station, the weight of everything that had happened finally sinking in. She had won, but the cost had been high. The whistleblower's identity had added a final unexpected twist to the story, one that left her reeling. But as she looked at the folder in her hands, the evidence that had brought down an empire, she knew it had all been worth it. The truth had come out, and justice had been served. And for the first time in a long time, Maya felt like she truly belonged. The days that followed were a whirlwind of chaos and clarity. News outlets exploded with the story, the live-streamed confrontation at the warehouse making headlines around the world. Richard Grayson and his inner circle were arrested, their empire crumbling under the weight of the evidence Maya and the whistleblower had uncovered. The airline's safety violations, the offshore accounts, the cover-ups. It was all laid bare, for the public to see. Passengers demanded accountability, employees rallied for change, and the FAA launched a full-scale investigation into the industry's practices. It was a victory, but it didn't come without its scars. Maya spent the first few days in a haze, giving statements to the police, meeting with investigators, and answering endless questions from reporters. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but she couldn't stop. There was too much to do, too many people counting on her. Elena's team worked tirelessly to keep the story alive, ensuring that Grayson and his team couldn't sweep anything under the rug. The whistleblower, whose name was revealed to be Alex Grayson, became a symbol of courage and sacrifice. Their decision to expose their own brother's corruption resonated with people everywhere, a reminder that doing the right thing often comes at a great personal cost. Javier stayed by Maya's side through it all, his loyalty unwavering. He had proven himself in the warehouse, risking his life to protect her and Elena. Maya knew she owed him more than she could ever repay, but he brushed it off with a smile. "We're a team," he said simply. "Always have been, always will be." His words brought her comfort, but they also stirred something else, a sense of guilt. She had doubted him, questioned his motives, and yet he had never wavered. It was a lesson she wouldn't soon forget. As the dust began to settle, Maya found herself standing at a crossroads. The airline offered her a promotion, a chance to help lead the company through its rebuilding process. It was a tempting offer, but it didn't feel right. She had fought too hard, sacrificed too much to simply step back into the system that had tried to destroy her. Instead, she decided to take a different path. With Elena's help, she launched a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting whistleblowers and advocating for transparency in the aviation industry. It was a way to turn her pain into purpose, to ensure that no one else would have to fight this battle alone. Alex Grayson became one of the nonprofit's first beneficiaries. Their recovery was slow, both physically and emotionally, but they found solace in knowing their actions had made a difference. Maya visited them often, the two of them forming an unlikely bond. "You changed everything," Maya told them one day sitting by their hospital bed. "You gave people hope." Alex smiled faintly, their eyes filled with a quiet determination. "We did it together," they said, "and we're not done yet."